You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Peter Singer. He has been dubbed by many as the world's most influential living philosopher. Singer is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He has written, co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 50 books, untold number of articles, and his writings have appeared in more than 25 languages. He is the founder and the board chair of The Life You Can Save, a nonprofit that fights extreme poverty. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a real honor to have you on.
My pleasure, Jeffrey.
So you had a very thought-provoking article about conspicuous consumption and that it will disappear in 50 years or in the next 50 years. Can you give an overview of your main thesis of this idea?
Yes. So I should say, I think that I was invited to contribute to a series that Vox was running on what is common now and will no longer be around in 2070. I might have started with eating meat, but that had already been taken by someone else.
Okay.
So this is another major interest of mine, and you know, perhaps it's on the optimistic side, whereas meat already seems to be on the way out. If you look at the impression Impossible burgers are making, but I'm not so sure about this one. But it did seem to me that it's so crazy that people still spend money on things that are really pointless and in a way, you know, less useful than other things that are much cheaper, but they do it purely for status. And the example that I start off with is these very fancy, very expensive mechanical watches that, you know, you can pay more or less anything for, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. And people buy these things and clearly they're buying them just for status because they don't keep time as well as the little digital Casio that I have on my wrist right now. They either need to be wound up or you need to keep moving, you know, so that if you leave them on your bedside table for a couple of days by mistake, they'll stop. And they're bigger and clunkier. And basically, what's the point except to show I'm so rich I can afford one of these really pointless, expensive watches. And you know, that just seems to me to be so crazy, especially in a world that has limited resources and that has huge problems that could do with more resources. What's the current figure? 736 million people are living in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank. They could obviously be helped with some resources that we might have to spare. There are things we could do to reduce climate change, which is a huge problem. If we put more money into solar, for example. So, you know, we are in a needy situation. We're not really globally in a situation of abundance. And I hope that people will come to see that over the next 50 years and see that there are many more urgent things than displaying your status. And in fact, that taste will change so that it will become not a positive thing to show that you're wasting money in this way, but people will say, you know, that's just really dumb.
Yeah, I think of the Birkin bag, right, which is a $70,000 handbag that you have to apply and they reject you and you have to go on a 2-year wait list to get it. So I want to take a step back and I'm going to push back on your thesis a little bit. If we think of, so John Maynard Keynes 100 years ago predicted that, so he did this in 1930, he predicted that 100 years hence, 100 years in the future, that we will be, you know, he said, 4 to 8 times richer, which turned out to be pretty much true, right? That we'll be ridiculously rich. And because of that, people won't need to work as much. And this was his big thesis, was that in the 21st century, people will be working 15 hours a week because we'll just have so much money that we'll naturally just live kind of a life of leisure. And of course, he was dreadfully wrong on that because he failed to realize the important role that work plays in our lives in terms of identity and meaning. And there are all these other reasons why we work other than just for money. And in connecting to that idea, right? In 50 years, we will be, in all likelihood, remarkably richer than we are today. So we'll have even more money to either put toward the causes that we would hope we would, towards climate change and poverty issues and whatever the issues of the day are in 2070. But on the other hand, the goal of individuals to flaunt their peacock feathers, I'm not sure that human temperament will change that much, right? And this is why it connects in my mind this idea of Keynes, all this money, but the innate desire to just show, could just be more exorbitant than it is today. And I like the optimism, so I just kind of want to push back on that idea.
Yeah, look, it's possible. I mean, I think prediction's a mug's game, really, except for the fact that as long as the prediction is far enough in the future and you're old enough, nobody's going to be able to tell you were wrong. Yeah. And with a 50-year prediction, for me, that certainly applies. So, yeah, I know there are these enduring elements of human nature, and seeking status is one of them. And I'm sure people will seek status. I guess what I'm suggesting is that they may find other more worthy ways of seeking status. So, for instance,
I certainly hope so.
Yeah. So one positive sign of this is I noticed that I think just this year, Forbes, which is, of course, famous for ranking the 400 wealthiest people, has also started ranking people for their philanthropy. So who are the biggest philanthropists, giving the most, and commenting on where they're giving it and how effectively as well. Of course, some giving is for status too, if you give to have an opera house built and named after you, but a lot of other giving is achieving important things. So, maybe that's a tiny little sign of a shift towards giving people status for good things that they do. I hope so.
So do you think are we more giving than we were in the past? Are we more utilitarian in nature? How has that changed from the past till to date?
Well, certainly the recent generation, or current generation of philanthropists, often coming out of tech, people like Bill and Melinda Gates, like Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna, they're certainly more giving, and giving more thoughtfully to where it's going than previous generations of philanthropists. And that's part of a larger movement called effective altruism, which is getting people to focus on the effectiveness of their giving. And there's now a lot more research about which charities give you the best bang for your buck in terms of when you're giving to them, what are they doing with it, how much good is it actually doing. And of course, the internet is a valuable tool for spreading that sort of information. So yeah, I think we are getting smarter in our giving, and certainly some of us are giving more than we used to too.
How do you think through impact in terms of philanthropy and giving?
Well, I think that you have to choose what your causes are, and for me, that means thinking about what is going to do the most good. And so take a couple of things that we've already mentioned in this podcast. On the one hand, building a new opera house, and on the other hand, helping people in extreme poverty to get out of poverty, or maybe helping their children simply to survive by having sanitation and safe drinking water, having protection against malaria. So I think it's pretty clear where the better value lies, that it's nice to have great opera houses, but it's really a luxury, and it doesn't make a very significant difference to people's lives, whereas some of the other things that I mentioned do. So that's one thing, find the actual cause that does more good. But the other thing then is to find the most effective organizations within that, and that's partly the most effective interventions. So what is it that's really been proven to have an effect at low cost? Distributing bed nets to people in regions where malaria is prevalent has been shown to save lives and reduce illness at very low cost, for instance. So it's finding those kinds of causes.
You have an interesting article that's critical of the Michael Bloomberg massive, I don't know, $2 billion donation to John Hopkins. Can you explain why you're critical of that donation?
Yes, and let me say Michael Bloomberg is someone I generally admire. I think he's done lots of good things. He did many good things as mayor of New York, and some of his philanthropy is excellent. But giving to your alma mater because it's your alma mater is already itself a little of a dubious choice, I think. I mean, you might want to give them something to show that you've got some connection with them. If Bloomberg had dropped $1 million or even 10 million on Johns Hopkins, I wouldn't have thought it was worth writing about. But as you say, almost $2 billion could do an immense amount of good. I think that, there are a number of things. One is, should you be giving that money for organizations based in the United States anyway, since people in the United States are far better off than people in low-income countries? And generally, I would say no. But in the case of giving to an educational institution, you might say, well, this is going to do a lot of good for people in developing countries. Johns Hopkins does have a world-renowned medical school, public health programs, so it conceivably could. But I don't think it was focused as narrowly as that. The other point, which is a nice point that Malcolm Gladwell actually has made in one of his revisionist history podcasts,
it's a great
I really enjoyed.
Yeah,
you know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So he talks about the fact that he thinks you do more good by giving to a small college, and he talks about someone who gave money to a small engineering school in New Jersey that had very little money, and that makes sense after all. It's kind of the laws of diminishing marginal utility that the richer some school is, the smaller the difference it's likely to make to add another $1 billion to its endowment.
Yeah, I don't think the development office from either your university, which is Princeton, or mine, which is Washington Lee, would play that.
No, well, I've talked to that. I've invited people from the Princeton development office to talk to my students occasionally.
Okay.
They're prepared to admit that there are other good causes around. They just want the students to say, well, just give us something. They say they're not greedy.
So you write about that you've noticed that this generation is more likely to go into fields of work after they graduate college that affirm meaning, and I'm very interested in this, and it's something that I care very much about. I have struggled to see that, at least from the undergraduates that I teach. On my last day of class for my management course that I teach, I give as much of a compelling argument as I possibly can that they should do interesting work and do work that makes a difference, and not really care about what it pays, given their education and what they get coming out of here. They all do very, very, very well, and that the money will follow. And I get this feeling that the students think, oh, that's nice, and then they all go into investment banking. So I was wondering your perspective, kind of maybe on the broader trend of students going into areas that are geared towards making a difference, and then how to kind of nudge the next generation into more compelling and more effective work.
Yes. Okay. So firstly, though, let me say that we shouldn't assume that students going into investment banking are doing it only from themselves. I've had at least one student of my own, and I've known of many others who've gone into investment banking or other fields where they can earn a lot of money precisely because they then want to give it away to the most effective charities they can find. And I have one student who's, must be probably 7 or 8 years out of graduating, who has been giving away at least half of his earnings to effective charities. And arguably, one of his options was to become a philosophy professor because he did very well at philosophy. I think it's not too hard to argue that he's done more good by giving to these highly effective charities, giving pretty large sums, as he's successful in having gone into it's actually a commodities trading firm he works for. So that he's done more good than he would have if he'd become a philosophy professor. So I think it's a question of what you're going to do with money rather than are you going to be earning money. But of course, there are a lot of other areas of interest, and I think we do need to have talented and committed people going into the non-profit sector. A lot of non-profits will benefit from having their talents. We need to have them going into government as well. And I don't just mean running for elected office, though that's certainly one possibility, but working for the government. The government needs to have talented people. I also know somebody else who went into working for the World Bank, and within a relatively few years, he didn't have to get very senior. He found himself in charge, I think, of a $300 million fund that was involved in helping women to get access to contraception, and he found significantly more effective ways of doing this that basically meant the fund could help about 6 times as many women as it had been before. So, that's an incredibly worthwhile impact to have. And I think, it's good for students to think about a lot of these options, and certainly not just assume that they want to go into the area that'll earn them the most money.
Sure. So one of the studies on happiness and money has shown that you do increase your overall level of happiness as you go from making $0 or $10,000 a year, and then it continues up, and then it plateaus after about $75,000. And that once you go from $75,000 a year to $500,000 to $800,000 to $1 million a year, there's no net increase in happiness. And yet that's at odds with a lot of human behavior, right? And we have this idea that people should be relatively aware of what drives their own happiness, and yet their behavior clearly is not in line with the happiness maximizing ideal.
Yeah, this might come back to what we were talking about before, right? I don't think there's any intrinsic gain in happiness through having a $60,000 watch on your arm, but it does enhance your status, as we were saying. So I think the same is true about earning $1 million rather than earning 70,000. You're likely to have higher status because you can afford all sorts of things that display your status, including the watch and fancy cars and a bigger home in a nice area. So I think that does matter to people, and it is a kind of illusion, as you're saying. I mean, when you ask people, they will talk about happiness. They won't say my chief aim in life is to rise to the highest possible status I can. But in fact, that's clearly a motivation, I think a kind of maybe a biologically given motivation, given that we had to compete with others in order to survive, and higher status gave you better reproductive opportunities or something like that. So, it may be there, and it may be kind of misleading us into doing things that are not going to make us happier.
So in management, we have the idea of what's called the Hertz factor model, which is that there are some things that you do in employment that the more that you have, it will give you a net increase in your job satisfaction or overall happiness. And these are things like the work itself, your ability for some kind of achievement, recognition, things like that. And then on the flip side, you have what we call dissatisfiers. And that's pay, right? So if you don't get enough pay, it makes it where you can be incredibly dissatisfied, right? You can imagine somebody who thinks that they're expecting a $70,000 a year salary. They end up getting $50,000 a year. I mean, that can really demean their sense of self. But increasing people's pay does not increase their overall happiness. Things like safety, right? So the presence of safety doesn't make you really like your job, though the absence of a safe environment would make you hate your job. So there are all these areas that work only on the negative, and there are some that are on the positive, and those tend to be the more affirming areas, like the meaning of your job, the feelings that you have about helping other people at work, and then the experience of the work itself. So I wanted to see what do you think of the kind of the broad view of the Hertzberg model?
Yeah, I certainly think that the meaning of your work is really important, and I should say, you did say that up to 70,000, it does make a difference if you increase. So if you're really not having enough to have a reasonably decent existence, which will of course vary with the society and culture you're in, because if you were living in a rural village in a low-income country, and you got sort of, $3,000 a year, you would be well off, and you would be very satisfied with that. But obviously, in the United States, you're not really going to cope with that.
Those studies, they do a purchase power parity, so it adjusts for costs in a local.
Sure.
Every society has their own number. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But once you get to that level, anyway, whatever that level is, where you feel reasonably comfortable, you can meet your basic needs, then the meaning and, if you like, the intrinsic value of your work, I think, has a lot to do with your attitudes, with your happiness. And there are plenty of studies showing that, and there are, I think, plenty of people now who are looking around more for finding meaning in their work. Once they get to a certain point. And sometimes I know people who are, more like my age, who sort of changed their career as they got older, because although they had plenty of money, they were not getting that meaning or satisfaction. And they realized that it was getting late, that they'd always wanted to do something more worthwhile, and now they were in danger of missing out. So I think that's a trend that's happening as people are living longer and being fit and capable longer. And I think it's also a factor with people who are making money at a fairly early age, as some are in the tech industry, that then they say, well, what am I going to do now? And I think that's the reason why a number of them do get involved in various causes, and particularly philanthropic causes, because they think, okay, I can do now something. Now that I've got this, I can do something that really is worthwhile and that really will be fulfilling and that will make me feel that I've lived my life well.
At this point in your career, what is your central driver?
I find myself fortunate, and there's still lots of things that I get invited to do, that I can do, that have a significant impact. For the last few months, I've been working on updating my book, The Life You Can Save, which is a book about global poverty and what we should do about it, that is about to have its 10th anniversary. And it spawned an organization that has the same name, The Life You Can Save, which recommends effective charities, what we've been talking about. And the guy who actually runs that, who's really one of these people I had in mind, somebody who had a very successful career in the retail industry, and then decided he wanted to do something more worthwhile with his life. So he had the idea of getting the rights for the book back from the publishers and issuing it free online and free as an audiobook as well. And that's what we're going to do. So later this year, this book will come out and hopefully will reach a really much wider audience, because it will be available free online. So, I find that a really worthwhile thing to do, because already I know the first edition of the book had an impact and led to several $1 million being donated to more effective causes than they would have, which I think has done a lot of good. So I'm hoping that this new edition will do even more. And it's those kinds of opportunities that get me up in the morning and at my desk early, so that I can get on with them and take advantage of them.
That's great. I mean, you're uniquely positioned to do that. So that's very cool.
Well, in some ways I am, yeah. But I mean, anybody can do something, right? Maybe I'm lucky that I can have more impact than most because of where I've got to. Yeah.
So you write about the hedonic treadmill. So that crosses over with a lot of the research in organizational behavior, back to the discussion about money and happiness and how life events impact your overall happiness. And so the basic idea is that you have an overall set level of happiness, and bad things happen to you, and then you kind of come back to your set level of happiness, and good things happen, and you have an increase, but you kind of get back down to your kind of set level of happiness. If you're naturally a happier person, then you tend to stick around there. If you're naturally less happy, you tend to stick around there. How do you think of the hedonic treadmill impacting the question of conspicuous consumption?
So my understanding of the research is that consumption goods tend to have just the effect that you described. That is, you buy something new, you get a temporary blip, it goes up, you feel good about it. but it fairly quickly settles down into where you were before. And so it's almost like a drug that you have to have more of it in order to get the same kind of high. And you keep doing this, and it doesn't really end up being very satisfying. But there are other goods that my reading of literature says do make a more long-term difference. And one of them I think we've talked about, and that is having fulfilling, meaningful work is an important part of that. And the other really big part of that is family and relationships, and having relationships that you feel are supportive and that are important to you also seems to be a pretty big factor in actually raising people's level of happiness in a more long-term way. So in other words, it's not something that's part of a treadmill.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, though you froze for a moment, but I can still hear you. Yeah, no, you're fine.
All right, in another article, you discuss these very interesting cross-cultural studies about people who return or do not return a lost wallet.
Oh, right. That's a really recent article that I just published on Project Syndicate. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you give just an overview of kind of what's your takeaway from those studies?
Yeah. So this is a really big study that was, I think, pretty well designed to see whether people were honest in returning a lost wallet when it was immediately apparent that you could return it, or at least that you could email the owner, because there were several business cards of the owner and the wallet was transparent, so you could see them as soon as you got the wallet. The wallet was not dropped in the street. It was handed in to places like a hotel desk, a post office desk, a police station, a whole variety of different places where there would be a desk and a reception. And you could hand this in and say, I just found this in the street. Can you take care of it? I'm in a real hurry. And then you rush off. You don't get a receipt. You don't leave your name. So it's really then testing the honesty of the person who is at that desk and receives it. Now, some of the wallets had money in it. Some of them had small amounts of money. Some of them had larger amounts of money. And one of the interesting findings is that, you might expect, economists might expect, that the ones with large amounts of money wouldn't be returned, or if they were going to be returned, they would be returned minus the money. But in fact, that didn't happen. The ones with money in them, with some amount of money in them, were more likely to get returned than the ones that just, for example, had a key in them, something that was no use to the finder but might be still valuable to the owner. And the ones with more money, and we're talking about something like $95, I think it was, were more likely to get returned than the ones with $13 or $14. So that's an interesting finding. And the researchers, Elaine Kahn and others, suggested that it relates to people's self-image. They don't want to have to see themselves as a thief. Now, if there's nothing in the wallet for you, if it's an empty wallet, or not quite empty, but it just has a key and the business cards in it, and a shopping list, I think it had, well, there's nothing in it. So, if I don't bother to email the guy whose name is on the cards, then, yeah, okay, I'm not a thief anyway. But if it has money in it and I keep it, I have to admit to myself that I am a thief. And so the hypothesis is that was a major factor. And it wasn't the only factor, because some wallets with keys in them were more likely to be returned than ones without keys, too. So altruism, concern for the owner, plays a role. But self-esteem seems to be really important here. And the other nice takeaway from this study is that the majority of wallets did get returned. It varied from country to country, but the majority did get returned, especially the ones with money in it, as I said. So people who think that everybody's selfish, that everybody's just in it for themselves, that nobody cares about anyone else, I think the study refutes that. I think it shows that there is a kind of a good amount of decency and honesty out there in the community, even if it's obviously never going to be 100%.
Right, because self-concept is really the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are drives our behavior. A follow-up study that I'm sure they can't do, that I would love to see done, would be, what if it's not $95 but $100,000? So now an amount that would really meaningfully change the lives of pretty much anybody. how do super large numbers change people's behavior? Obviously, they wouldn't be able to do that. My hypothesis would be that if you get high enough, that it actually dips back down.
Well, it would be a very expensive study to run, obviously. But there, so yeah, I don't think you could do a big study on it of this sort. But there are certainly anecdotal cases of sacks of cash that fell off the back of trucks that people have returned to the police station or called Brinks or whoever it might be who lost it. So it happens. I don't know how often it happens.
Right, it would be a question of statistics. All right, can we finish with a few just rapid fire questions?
Sure.
All right. These are on a whole host of issues that I know you think about. Should CRISPR and gene editing be available to patients?
I think it should be available if it can be available fairly distributed, so it doesn't just advantage the rich.
Okay. Should there be a wealth tax?
There should be a wealth tax if it can be globally put, or obviously there's not much point in having a wealth tax if it just means that the rich people in your country emigrate to somewhere else to evade the tax. But ideally, yes, there should be a wealth tax.
That's like the Piketty argument, who wrote Capital in the 21st century.
Yeah, right.
Will artificial intelligence ever be morally responsible for its own actions?
Yeah, that's one of those predictions again that I'm not going to live to be told that I was wrong. If you say ever, then I say ever is a very long time, and I would say yes.
Should children have the right to euthanasia?
Depending on the age, but if by a child you mean somebody who is not a legal adult, so under 18, then I think the answer is yes. If they're significantly younger than 18, I think the parents' consent should be required.
In light of Trump's behavior with climate change or family separation, should the rest of the world do some kind of boycott of the United States?
I think the climate change actually is a real issue on which that would be justifiable. In terms of immigration, well, other countries would have to look at their own policies. I'm here in Australia. Australia is certainly not accepting large numbers of asylum seekers. But climate change is actually hurting everybody. And it gives the United States a competitive advantage if it just uses the cheapest available energy. Let's say that's from coal. And other nations wanting to do the right thing don't use the cheapest available energy. So I think it would be totally justifiable to say, even for the World Trade Organization to say America is taking unfair advantage of this, and for other nations ought to either boycott or general public could boycott American goods, or they could put a tariff on American goods roughly related to the economic advantage that America may get by not doing anything about climate change.
All right, just one more, and it's kind of along those lines. How has the rise of authoritarianism and nationalism globally impacted your perspective on the issues that you care about, such as utilitarianism?
It doesn't at all impact my view that utilitarianism is the right ethical approach. What it has more impact on is my hopes for global solutions to problems. I wrote a book called One World, which originally came out in 2002, and then there's a newer edition called One World Now that came out just a couple of years ago. I think in the first edition I was optimistic about nations getting together to solve problems like climate change, global poverty, introduce a kind of global criminal law like the International Criminal Court to stop crimes against humanity, and a better and fairer trade system. I think that agenda has at least been postponed. I don't think it's going to happen in the present atmosphere of nationalism and populism. I hope that this will just be a temporary swing of the pendulum, and that it will swing back in the other direction before very long. Otherwise, we are going to have very serious problems, particularly with climate change.
All right. I think we should probably call it a day. I can't thank you enough. You're one of the most fascinating people that I've I've read a lot of your work that I've come across. Keep doing the great work. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.